Mr. McDurmon, does the defense wish to make a closing statement?
Yes,
Closing
Your Honor.
argument? Thank you.
Just a short word about how this works. The state gets to split their argument. So they'll make an argument, I get to make an argument, they get the last word too. So I get the first word, last word, and I won't get to rebut that. And that's just the way it is. We accept that. You've all taken an oath. And you've taken an oath, and the judge will instruct you in just a minute. Not my words, not their words. The law that will require you to decide this case based on evidence. Based on evidence. You remember in my opening statement, I told you that the state has got gaping holes in this case. And that the state is going to give you bits and pieces of evidence. And that it is going to tell you a story to fill those in the way that suits them. And it's going to ask you to imagine along with them that that story is true. And it's going to ask you to make a leap of logic at the end of it. From alleged instances of abuse to murder. And I have asked you to follow your oath, to follow the law, to decide the case based on the evidence, not on the imagination. Let's talk about the evidence a little bit. You've been told about the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. I won't rehearse the story, the lesson. What hard evidence exists in this case? I will submit to you that not one bit of direct evidence in this case points to that man right there. Not one. I'm not saying there's no direct evidence in this case. There's lots of it. There is obviously the remains. There is the manner in which those remains were recovered. We had the head discovered in the street on April 29th. We're not exactly sure how it got there. One detective thinks there was a great rain event that washed it out. Another one says there was a dog. We don't know. And then about a month later or so, they discovered several bags in the wooded lot behind the trucking business. Some people call it junkyard. Come back to that. The medical examiner eventually is able to identify the skull using dental records, dental charts. And notes that there are tool marks, of course, on the body parts. After some time goes by, we also know that there was a search of Christopher's former residence. There was lots of evidence taken from this. The lots of evidence that came from the remains. As we've talked about before, there were paint chips in the hair. There were human hairs, apparently not Melissa's. There were pubic hairs. There was a pubic hair. There was DNA evidence. There were carpet fibers. There's lots of evidence. And you heard the detectives sit there and tell you, we specifically sent this off for testing. Some of it more than once. Whoever's hair that was in there that wasn't Melissa's was also not his. Whoever's pubic hair that was also not his. wherever those paint chips came from, it was not from his residence. Someone says, oh, it was remodeled. It may have been remodeled, but folks, when you paint over paint, the old paint's still under there. And you go scrape a paint sample, you're going to get all of it. None of it matched. There was luminol evidence. It sprayed the entire house, not a drop. And finally, the more modern DNA taken from the bag. You heard Detective Stein sit there and talk about the event where they went out with all the media to the site, looked at the proximity to where Christopher had worked. You heard him testify about the DNA in the bags, and he read the results of those reports. Yes, we found DNA. Yes, there was a viable profile that represented 5 people, two of whom at least were male. And they submitted Christopher's DNA sample. They went up specifically again to get new DNA from him and submit it for that test. That was in 2022 or so. Christopher willingly submitted. Yeah, he knew the DAs were still investigating him. He didn't run from it when they called him and said, hey, we'd like to get your DNA. And he submits it, and you heard the results of the test. Christopher Wolfenbarger is excluded from being a contributor. Well, that's when we hear this theory about there was a great rain flood event. I gave this page from the weather reports. The National Climatic Data Center for the City of Atlanta in April of 1999. I gave it to Detective Shepard. And you saw him pretend he couldn't. Or I believe it was Don gave it to the detective. And you saw him pretend, oh, I'm not comfortable reading this. This document's going to go back with you into evidence. And you all can look at it. And if there's a single one of you who can't figure it out, I would be shocked. The days go down here, the days of the month, the hours of the day go this way, and at the end there's a cumulative total of the rainfall for each day. And you'll be able to look at this document and see that on that day, the other deputy who said there was an intermittent mist was correct. There was roughly 1/4 of an inch of rain for the entire day. And most of it appears to have fallen at about 3 o'clock in the morning, long before that had appeared on the road that day. And you can look up the rest of the way. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Detective Shepard. Oh, it rained so much that month. No, it didn't. They analyzed the carpet fibers. They could find no match in Christopher's house. So then we're told about the circumstantial evidence. It's interesting to me that you just heard the district attorney tell you all the facts and evidence in this case point to one man. But he's not talking about this hard evidence, is he? Because there's a bunch of that, and not a single bit of it points to this man. All of it points away from this man. But Detective Shepard, or maybe it was Detective Calhoun, one of the two, got on the stand and said, there's only been one suspect in this case from day one. Well, when the results keep pointing away and pointing away and pointing away, maybe there should have been a different one. Maybe you should have asked some more questions of the neighbors or of the family. You heard the district attorney here tell you. That's how we conduct investigations. We look at the person's life. We want to find out what's going on in their life. They never investigated that family. They never investigated anybody else. Where are the records of the tests of paint chips for a single other person's house? Where are the records for a search warrant from a single other individual's house? Where are the search warrants getting hair or pubic hair or DNA from anybody else in this investigation? Crickets. Because they want to tell you a story about domestic violence. I'm a supporter of the Me Too movement. Domestic violence is a real thing. You've heard the district attorney tell you multiple times now, this is a case about domestic violence. It may have that question in it somehow. Certainly it does. It is an issue you're going to have to decide. You're going to have to decide how much weight to attribute to those alleged incidents. And you're going to have to decide, as a fact finder and determiner in this case, how it fits into the overall picture. But this is not a case about domestic violence. This is a case in which a man is charged with an act of murder. And the state has not given you one single instance or bit of evidence about an act of murder. They want to get you sympathetically on the board. After he tells you, don't judge this by sympathy. But then he wants to tell you all these violent instances, and he wants to embellish them. He punched her. That's not an evidence anywhere. He beat her all the time for the whole year. That's not an evidence anywhere. And they want to tell you that story and then ask you to make the leap to there must have been some act of murder also. What about these instances of domestic violence? We heard from first about the July 1998 incident. Yes, there's a police report. We had a police officer testify. He told you he did not look under her clothing. How could he have known if there were scrapes on her back or backside? He told you that. I didn't look at that. We get home and Norma says, well, I got home with her and she had scrapes all down her backside. Just after she had gotten done telling you that she was wearing blue jeans. I'm not sure how you get scrapes if you fall on the ground with blue jeans on. You have reports from Tina. Tina says she came in there with choke marks on her neck. And there was another guy named Clint who stood up for her. None of that story is corroborated by anybody else anywhere. The only person who's ever told that story is Tina Packer. Tina says she took Melissa back up to Chris's house on Brookline and confronted Christopher. But Christopher tells Detective Stott in his interview that he didn't like Melissa staying with her sister, because she got her into cigarettes and also was doing meth. Not necessarily that Melissa was doing it, but that he didn't like Melissa around that stuff. Well, I think there would be a confrontation when she brought her up there. We've heard from Mr. Dixon about domestic violence. It is funny to me. You should find it incredible that when he gives an interview in 2003 to the police about Melissa, he does not one time mention abuse, marks on her body, being drugged on the sidewalk, her complaining about her husband. He does not mention it one single time in an hours-long interview. And suddenly, when they find him at the last minute before trial, they find out he's been watching true crime shows about this, and suddenly he remembers this incident where she had bruises and she was drugged on the sidewalk. The testimony is not credible from a former Waffle House employee and bank robber, Mr. Dixon. You heard evidence from Miss Cooley, lived across the street. She seemed to be confused about a lot of her facts and details. Testimony was difficult to follow. But she says, oh yeah, I heard screaming and breaking glass over there all the time. There was apparently no glass left in the house at some point. Definitely from that house. Definitely that house where Chris lived. And I know that because that's the house I went in and cleaned. I cleaned all the houses that Mr. Holyfield owned. Who's Mr. Holyfield? Holyfield didn't own that house. You heard testimony from several people. That house was owned by Christopher's parents. Miss Cooley was never in there. I think Miss Cooley's confused as to what she's talking about. Oh, well, I definitely saw a black eye behind the glasses. And then she said a few moments later, I only saw her passing a few times when she was getting in the car to go to the grocery store. Never talked to her, just said hi. Testimony about a saw. Oh, he had access to a sawzall. Well, their memory seems to be just as cloudy and hazy as a lot of people. And this is a 26-year-old case, that's understandable. But I look at the statements that were made, and I see at least 4 different versions of that story that have been told. In the original detectives' reports, they said a saw went missing while Chris worked there. And we thought it was Chris. We blamed Chris. And we never found him. And then later it turned into he stole a saw. And then later they backed off and said, well, no, he asked to borrow a saw, and we never gave it back. You heard them. Their own witness, they had to impeach you by playing things that were in audio because they said they didn't even remember saying that. And they testified here that he took a saw, not saying he stole it, whatever. And she didn't even remember talking to me a couple weeks before that, before trial. She didn't remember telling me on the phone that, yeah, he brought it back. My apologies. Circumstantial evidence about alleged conflicts in Christopher's statement. What conflict did you hear in his statement? Inconsistencies, that was the word. There were inconsistencies in Christopher's interviews. And they play for you the interview with Mr. Stott, 2001, and then they play for you the interview with Detective Shepard in 2021. In one version of those stories, in the 2001 interview, Chris tells that the last time he ever saw Melissa, she was walking down Lee Street by the MARTA station. And he stopped to pick her up, took her up the road to Taco Bell. It's right by the interstate. And when they were done talking, apparently she talked about wanting to get back together. He said that was too emotional for him at this point, and he dropped her off back at the train station. And she left back north. Lee Street, Market Station. How far is that from Christopher's house? Because when these new investigators came in 2021 and tried to trip him up with this stuff, all these details from 18 years or 20 years prior, they asked him a specific question. Do you remember telling him the last time you saw her, she was walking down Brookline Street? I'd be a little confused too, because he never said that. Now, whether he remembered the other statement from up Lee Street or not, I don't know. But again, you're 20 years later. Is Christopher the only one in this entire trial that doesn't get a pass on memory? When witness after witness is standing here and say, I can't remember that, I don't recall. At least the police officers get to carry their report with them and read the details and pretend they remembered it. This business about hiding. Folks, Christopher cooperated with police time after time after time. I don't have to list it all tediously again, all the DNA results, the hair, the pubic hair, everything else. Every time they called him and said, we want this, he showed up. They could have showed up at his door that day. He would have walked out to them. They could have arrested him right there. But they chose to use some kind of SWAT team enforcement with unmarked cars, no lights. If you ever see the video again, you will notice when those cars pull up, no lights are on. Later in the video, when they're all up at his house, then they have their lights on. They don't turn it on until later. No marks on those cars. The only marked car was all black with black letters. So if you're viewing that coming up your driveway and armed men get out with M16s, what are you going to do? Walk out and greet them? Look, it was rational to fear that, okay? It's rational to be afraid. Imagine if you're seeing that through a home security video and you can have even less resolution. And so in order to connect their stories about domestic violence, to embellish them, and then create a story that somehow leads to a murder, they bring in domestic violence expert. And she tells us what she tells us. Much of which may be valid in certain contexts. And she says, well, if you're leaving, that's a sign of domestic abuse. But if you're returning, we can also explain that as domestic abuse. And if you're at any point in this cycle, virtually any behavior can be explained as part of a cycle of abuse. And Ms. Hilton gave very pointed hypotheticals, clearly designed to apply to this case. And she says, yes, clearly that's domestic abuse. Yes, clearly that's isolating somebody. Yes, clearly that's reconciliation. Yes, yes, yes. No hesitation whatsoever. But when the defense just tweaked the hypothetical just a little bit, her answer was what? Yes? No? No, her answer was, I don't know. I need more facts. I need to know what the abuse situation is. And wait a minute. How can you jump on a hypothetical when she asked it, and when we ask it, we get him hauled around? And it turns out she's a former employee at the DA's office. She's effectively like having an extra prosecutor up there on the stand to hit softballs they throw at him. So what you have happen is you have the state telling you a story that they want you to believe that leads to a murder for which they have no evidence, an act for which they have no evidence, an intent for which they have no evidence, and an unlawful killing for which they have no evidence. And they want you to follow their story to judge something based on no evidence. And all the other evidence in the case that points away from Christopher, every bit of hard evidence in the case that points away from Christopher, they spend their time trying to fight against that. Normally the roles are reversed. Normally the state's putting up the hard evidence and the defense has to say, well, that's not right, this is not right, that doesn't apply. But they wanted to know, well, the DNA must have been corrupted because of a rainstorm or whatever. But literally all the evidence points away from Christopher, except for the story. We've been told, or you've been told, that the defense's story, the defense is Carl Patton did. We've never said that. And we've certainly never singled out Carl Patton as the only possibility. I want to share something with you that you're also going to hear in a few minutes. And this again is from the law. An interesting thing the DA said a while ago. He said, they're trying to tell you that Carl Patton did this. But the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They haven't given you proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Carl Patton did this. Well, that's not quite how it works. The only person in this room for which the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt applies is the defendant. Any other evidence, you're allowed to determine how you think it may apply. Now, it may fit in the case. And this is the law that she's going to read to you in a minute. Not the law he just told you about. This is the law she's going to read you. Of course, you have to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt. And in a case like this one, where the only evidence against the defendant is circumstantial, our statutes and our courts have determined that this is how you should interpret beyond a reasonable doubt. You would be authorized to convict only if the evidence, whether direct or circumstantial, or both, excludes all reasonable theories of innocence and proves the guilt of the accused beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, in a case in which there's circumstantial evidence only, you have to exclude every other reasonable possibility. And friends, that's where you do get to use your imagination. I'm not inviting you to come up with Disneyland fairy tales. No, that's vague and arbitrary. That's what the statute outlaws. But if there's any other reasonable possibility to explain the death of Melissa Wolfenbarger, then you must acquit. From the evidence you have, the hard evidence you have remains. You know the area she lived in. You know she was going to Doraville. You know she was riding the train. You know she was getting off that train at midnight and walking from the Lee Street station to Brookline or wherever else she went regularly at night, midnight in the West End. We know she was hanging out with people who were drinking a lot. We know that at least, according to some people in the evidence, some of those people were doing drugs. And when drugs and alcohol are involved in anything, the pool of potential suspects is a chasm. I don't have to find one and bring it to you and say, this guy did it, and I can prove it to you beyond reasonable doubt. You just have to be able to understand it could have been anybody, and that's reasonable. And that's where people like Carl Patton do come in, and Norma Patton. The whole thing about the 5 murders and the dumping bodies in the river and the covering it up for many, many years. But we also find out that one of his victims was a drug dealer that Carl worked for. We also find out that he engaged in contract killing. We also find out that there was a member of their family in some common law way whose father Carl had killed. And he didn't find out until sometime later. The same man also hung out in that household, was friends with the Patton family, and later was accused of molesting Melissa. And Norma, and with Melissa's testimony, apparently tried to get him indicted. Does this man have a motive to get revenge against Carl? Yes. Does he have a motive to get revenge against Norma and even Melissa? Yes. Is it reasonable to believe he could have been involved? Absolutely. Is it reasonable to believe that one of her new boyfriends was involved when he found out she had a husband? When he found out or heard a rumor that she was pregnant? Is it reasonably possible that she did find out what her dad had been doing and came to him needing money, came to him with a, I will expose you? Is it possible that living in that area, she got involved in a drug deal gone bad? Why would they dismember her? Dismembering is not, it's not common, but it's not unheard of even in drug deals. It's a way to dispose of a body. It doesn't have to be ritualistic. You don't have to be Jeffrey Dahmer. And in fact, that's what the state's alleging in this case, that it was merely a means of trying to hide a body. What if she owes somebody a drug debt? Here's a possibility. How do you know that she didn't die of an overdose in somebody's house and they had criminality in their house and they panicked and tried to hide the body? Where's your evidence? It just has to be a reasonable theory. That's what the law says. You can't rule it out. There's not one of these scenarios you can rule out. And if you can't rule it out, that's a reasonable doubt. Maybe she really was pregnant. Maybe she tried to have an unsafe abortion. Where's your evidence, sir? It just has to be a reasonable theory. If the state had done more investigation, maybe we could have eliminated some of these, but we can't. You can't rule these out. Is it possible that destitute, poor, no hope, she did take her own life, and then somebody found her body and tried to get rid of it? Is it possible? The state has not ruled out any of these. It has told you a story about one possibility. It has embellished some of the details and asked you to imagine that it went all the way to a murder. autopsy, etc. The bags were found in a wooded area. We heard testimony from Miss Miller, the investigator who was there, the one who found the first bag, state that she found it right by a pathway. Now, why did they even start looking back there? She told you. She told you the owner of that trucking company said, why don't you go look back behind here, because there's a cut through that people use in a wooded area that drug dealers and other people use. That's what she said. She testified to that. And they go back there and start searching, and lo and behold, the dog actually misses it, but she spots this bag right by the trail. And we saw pictures of several of those bags that she described as being in a clearing or on the trail. Not pushed up under the brush. No attempt to hide these things. Those bags were even either thrown there to be found by somebody, or they were just haphazardly thrown there. But the least likely scenario is that someone was taking care to try to hide them. Did somebody kill Melissa and throw it where it would be found, right where Chris worked, to send a message? You can't rule it out. That's a reasonable doubt. The domestic violence incident expert spoke about that. Have you considered the evidence we've heard about how Melissa was raped, about how she was locked in a room, how she was, according to Ms. Waddell, stunted in her intellectual development, unsocial, very easily controlled, naive? Why is it that when she goes to Kathy's house and she says, I want to turn my children over to you, and then she goes to, writes a letter to Norman and says, no, I want to give all the custody and come see you and stay away from her? Why is it that she talks that way to one side and talks a different way to the other side? Maybe she had a power and control relationship with her mother. Maybe the power and control wheel applies in that relationship too. Maybe when she went up to get her from Brookline and helped her file her police report and helped her go file a court protective order, then took her home and helped her took her to Henry County to try to get custody back. Maybe that was exactly what Wendy was telling us. She's easily controlled, and maybe those weren't her own actions. Maybe she was being influenced by the person that used to lock her in a room every day and deprive her and control her. I think it's interesting that the incident happens in 1998, and all of the things in the power control wheel are suddenly in Melissa and Norma's favor, according to their understanding of how the law worked. You remember, I asked her, did you understand that you just go down to the court and say, I want my kids back, and they give your kids back? Now, I know because I'm an attorney and I read the law. Actually, we talked about it here as well in testimony. That's not quite how it works. But Norma testified that that was her understanding, and it was Melissa's understanding at the time. So, what happens? Melissa's with her at that time, not with Chris. Melissa went down and said, I want my kids back. So as far as they understood, they had custody back. They had the physical custody of the kids because they had them at their home at that time for those few days. And they had filed a restraining order against Chris, which would have required him to stay away from them. So according to the power control wheel, everything was in their favor, if that's what Melissa really wanted. If what Norman is telling us in her version of the story is actually true, there would have been no reason to go back to Chris whatsoever. And yet, she goes to her court date and dismisses it. Oh, that's evidence of abuse of power and control. But the power and control was with her mother. She could have easily stood up and said at that time, I'm done. I have everything I want. I don't need you. You can stay away from me. But she didn't. At that moment, she had a choice to go back to Norma Patton or to go back to Chris. And she chose Chris. We're told this sentimental story at the end. Melissa, last time I talked to her, she said she only wanted one Christmas present. Picture of her and her pawpaw. You've heard no evidence in this case that she ever even hung out with her pawpaw. But you have heard evidence in this case that her pawpaw was a blackout drunk who slept on the couch. It doesn't make sense. You've heard evidence that Tina Patton insisted in 2003 interview with Mr. Calhoun that she saw Melissa on her birthday in 1999. That was March 28th. She told Calhoun, she emphasized it over and over, I know I saw her. And she said her mother tried to get her to change the story because it didn't line up with her narrative of when Melissa had died. But if she saw her in March 28th of 1999, we know that Chris stopped working at Action Glass at the beginning of February, and he wasn't living there anymore. It's interesting to me that Mr. Calhoun testified that no, Christopher's property was never searched by dogs. They weren't allowed to search. He sat there confidently and told me. Sergeant Lacoste got on the stand the next day, and not even from our questioning, from their questioning, volunteered the fact that, yeah, there had been a dog search, and I was there, and yes, they did search the property, and they found nothing. Do you remember Miss Cooley talking about, oh, he built a concrete pad in the back? Why bring that evidence in? Except to create an insinuation, oh, he had told somebody allegedly at Waffle House one time about that's how you hide a body. You put it under the foundation of a house and say, well, he made his own little foundation in the back. And, ooh, her torso was underneath there. Well, the dogs didn't find it. So whatever that evidence purpose was, it, like all the other hard evidence, doesn't point to Chris. Mr. Shepard emphasized to us about the importance of the workplace proximity. This also came up during Mr. Stein's testimony. And it's been emphasized by the DAs over and over again. Showing you the map, showing you the dot on the map where it's at, and right here's Christopher's workplace. You've seen that probably 5 or 10 times. And you've heard testimony about it. And Detective Shepard gets up and drives that point home saying, well, it's more likely that that's where the body was hidden because he didn't have to carry it very far. It's right there. And you heard this testimony about how they went out to the scene and they took the podcasters with them, and they took the media with them, and they took DAs with them, and they had this big publicity stunt about, oh, here's where the head was, and right there is his place of work. I almost expect to hear the dun-dun-dun music in the background. And then you learn about Carl Patton's murders. He killed people in his living room, wrapped them up in a camper out back, and then drove them 30 miles to dump them in a river. Proximity is not proof of who did it. And the medical examiner, Dr. Terry, brilliant Dr. Terry, the one I was afraid to object to her qualification. Brilliant. Fascinating to talk to. Examined Melissa's remains and made a conclusion that supports my argument. Cause of death is undetermined. Well, there was just she said concealment of remains. I think that's a little argumentative. That is a little argumentative. Because she doesn't know if it was bagged for the purpose of concealing or just disposing, or just transporting to be disposed. She doesn't know the intent of the person who bagged it. She can't testify to that. But there was decomposition, true, and there was incomplete discovery of the remains. And her conclusion is, I can't determine how she died. And Mr. Fawcett asked her a series of questions. Can you tell if it was strangulation? Can you tell if it was stabbing? No. Can you tell if it was shooting? No. Can you tell if it was poison? No. And I want you to interpret what that really means, what they're really saying. Can you determine if she was stabbed to death? No. What that sentence really means is we have no evidence she was stabbed. Can you determine if she was poisoned? No. What that evidence really means is we have no evidence she was poisoned. Can you determine if she was beaten to death? No. We have no evidence she was beaten to death. You have no evidence of a murderous act. You have no evidence of malice being formed, whether in an instant or at some point before. You have no evidence of murderous intent. Well, but it was very likely unnatural. I can authoritatively say that as a medical examiner. This was definitely not a natural death. Very likely not a natural death. You don't need to be a medical examiner to figure that out. Although there are all the scenarios I gave you that you can't rule out, such as overdose. At this point, all the medical examiner can tell you is about post-mortem injuries. You don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You may have a suspicion that Christopher did it. That's not enough. You may have a strong suspicion that Christopher did it. That is not enough. You may gravely suspect that Christopher did it. And the judge is going to read you a law here in a minute that says a grave suspicion is not sufficient. You need proof beyond any reasonable doubt that excludes every reasonable alternative. The state's theory is asking you to do a couple of things, and I'm winding up. The first thing it asks you is to ignore all the physical evidence and just listen to our story about domestic abuse. And in doing that, it's asking you to believe this, that man right there is so brilliant, he can pull off a mastermind murder. He didn't leave a shred of DNA. He didn't leave a shred of carpet fiber, hair fiber, pubic hair. He didn't leave a shred of anything that our most powerful forensic machines can pick up. Not one shred. And then was dumb enough to dump the body right by where he was. That doesn't make sense. Melissa was surrounded by criminals, violent criminals, drug users, drug dealers, a dangerous area of town. You heard Miss Rock say, I would not walk the streets there at night by myself. She was beset everywhere she went by those dangers. And yet the state is asking you to believe what they're calling an abuser must necessarily become a murderer. But at the same time, that people we know are murderous somehow turn into angels. You can't believe both those things. And I would ask you not to follow your imagination on either one of you. Don't let the state force you to follow its story, which is imagination. Demand evidence that a murder happened, that an act of murder happened. Demand proof beyond a reasonable doubt that an act happened, that there was intent formed, that the killing was indeed unlawful, and that it was with malice aforethought. And when you get done deliberating, we ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.
Thank you.